Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming to our ACSES seminar. I'm going to start with an acknowledgement of country. I would like to acknowledge that we are on the lands of the Wajak Noongar people and pay our respects to elders past, present, and future. In 2024, ACSES funded 10 small research grants, and the final reports from those grants are now coming in and undergoing review. We'll be publishing the final reports over the coming months, so please do look out for those on our website. We are pleased, though, to partner with some of the respective grant recipients to start sharing findings from their research. And today, we are very delighted to have the project team from the ACSES Small Research Grant titled Study or Starve: Financial Challenges of Students Studying in Australian and New Zealand Universities to share early findings from their project. The project team is led by Associate Professor Anne McMahon, Honorary Senior Fellow at the University of Wollongong. She's joined by her multidisciplinary team from various areas, mainly from the University of Wollongong and Edith Cowan University on this project. The project members are Dr Joanna Russell, Professor Yasmin Probst, Associate Professor Kelly Lambert, Dr Katherine Kent, Professor Karen Charlton, Dr Kylie Austin, and Dr Gabby O'Flynn. We'll have approximately 45 minutes for the presentation, followed by 15 minutes Q&A from the audience. We will be using the Q&A function rather than the chat to put in your questions, so please do use the Q&A function at any time during the presentation, and I'll moderate the Q&A at the end. I'll now hand over to Anne in the first instance for the presentation. Anne, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much. I'll just wait for Dr. Jo Russell to pop up. Thank you. Okay, so firstly, thanks so much to ACSES. The team have been amazing and supportive, and we are very grateful for the grant that we received last year to look into this very troublesome and very difficult situation that many of our students are facing across Australia and New Zealand. I'd briefly like to say that I'm on Dharawal country, beautiful Eastern Australia. So I'll be saying good afternoon to some of you and good morning to others. But I would also like to say I appreciate and value elders past, present and emerging, and look forward to working with you continually into the future. Next slide, please. So I'd like to say this is somewhat of a romanticised version, I think many of us would consider, about students today. Here is obviously a well-nourished, well-supported student in the perfect environment, able to engage with his studies, looking fully supported to be able to do so, accessing the right materials and doing so in a safe and secure manner. I'm sure that many of you here today will appreciate that we are not seeing that in our student cohort. Many are working at least one job, sometimes multiple, and sometimes working full-time loads while trying to do full-time academic loads as well. Obviously, this impacts their ability to be able to perform at their best and to get to the future careers that they aspire to. I've been in academia now for 26 years, and the last 4 years have been student-facing around academic progression issues. And I can firmly say, like along with my colleagues in this research team, that most of the problems we are facing with academic progression relate to financial and social issues. Next slide, please. So this actually was born out of a commentary to from our placement coordinators from a dietetic student discipline space, where we had the coordinators come to us and say, we're really concerned about the students and their financial position and how it's affecting their placement progression. And this is the study that we published just recently, and it looked at speaking with 530 students across Australia and New Zealand in that August 2023 to January 2024 timeframe. We also did some in-depth interview, actually looking at their lived experience. But just a quick highlight that what we found is that placement poverty is what we've coined it, and many other people have now too, of course. But we saw that students were spending somewhere between 600 and nearly 3,500, particularly if they were health students, over their each placement spot. and obviously coming into a lot of challenges in doing so. I still remember hearing from a nursing student who paid just over $3,000 for her final 6 weeks placement in a metropolitan Sydney hospital in terms of all her expenses, often using limited transport, walking and missing meals to do so, and basically was conducting full R&N capacity in terms of her role with limited supervision. So she basically was paying for the privilege of working for free, not what we want to see. Next slide, please. So this is not alone in terms of all our experiences here, no doubt, that there is this growing issue about financial hardship. There are multiple social and economic problems facing Australians right across the board, but those that are most vulnerable are our student cohorts, because they come with very limited financial backing unless they're coming from very privileged background, and they're facing the same issues as many Australians are: housing issues, food security. And certainly what they're trying to do is balance their education with their expenses, and it's coming at enormous mental and physical health costs. Next slide, please. This is particularly a problem in terms of basic life behaviours and life management. So what we really worry about is the housing affordability and safety for our students when they're trying to study. People sleeping on couches at university to avoid accommodation fees is not uncommon. Food security issues are really quite dramatic, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But certainly we do know some students are able to access government support, but it's somewhat limited and really doesn't help those students who are self-funded and coming from a background where their parents do appear to earn a lot of money, but are actually not able to support their student son or daughter. So next slide, please. So there is a general also lack of awareness about where do you go to if you have needs for financial or other support. What we do find is that when you are asking financial support, it's actually quite complex and challenging, and it really is off-putting, particularly if you come from a different background, somewhat already challenged about getting into this space, in this environmental space of tertiary education. And there's clear social stigma about asking for help in terms of finances, particularly when people are saying, we're all doing it tough, and why would you be any different to us? And this is particularly, of course, around cultural issues for some populations that are international, that are actually finding it very difficult to ask for help. Next slide, please. So what we aim to do was really look at this more broadly, not beyond the students who are doing placement, but to look at the whole cohort of students across Australia. So we looked at evidence gathering that we already could collect. So we've done a very comprehensive scoping review that Karen Charlton will talk about today. We've also looked at what does it look like for a student if they're trying to find information from universities. So we've done a desktop audit, and Joanna Russell will talk about that today. And we've also got some empirical evidence that from over 900 students that we've actually captured their thoughts across Australia and some from New Zealand about the financial hardships that they're facing, and including some of the impacts of that, and also being able to talk to them more in depth to get their lived experience. This is all contributed to a very strong evidence-based recommendations and conclusions, which we'll also take you through. I'll now hand over to Karen Charlton. Thank you. Next slides.
Thanks, Anne. So I'll get into the first study that we did. So the first step in our research project was to explore and synthesize the evidence already out there on the extent and impact of financial challenges experienced by university students in both Australia and New Zealand. So we had two main research questions we wanted to look at in this review. So the financial challenges and impacts, but also secondly, what approaches are in place by government and agencies across these two countries to address these financial hardships. So I'm pleased to say that this scoping review has been published already earlier this year. It is available through open access, and the reference is provided there for you. So I'm just going to give you a really brief overview of what we found. Thank you, Jo. So I've explained the context. So it's looking at, sorry, one back. looking at key challenges and effectiveness of support systems. We wanted to, as I said, start off with evidence-based to see what is out there. And then that has sort of led the rest of the research that we have conducted to date. Next slide, please. So we did this scoping review according to best practice. We followed ACSES and O'Malley 2005 framework to conduct it. We searched 4 scientific databases. So it was really a thorough review of the literature. We identified 3,541 articles, of which 19 were included in the final review. So these are sort of the 3 main findings that came out of these 19 articles that we reviewed. Sorry, I just got distracted with the chat. Up to 68% of students experienced financial hardship in these 15 published studies. And this was highly related to emotional stress, but also poor academic performance. There were groups that were more at risk, including international students, Indigenous students, and those with disabilities. So they faced greater challenges. And in 8 of the studies, they explored available support services for students and how students experienced those supports. And unfortunately, many students were unaware of such services. And the services were quite broad-ranging: food assistance, financial aid, emergency grants, things like that, but also social support such as counselling and academic initiatives such as workshops. So there are services out there that are offered across many universities, but students are often unaware of this, and the complex application processes discourage utilisation and uptake. And of course, the stigma and other barriers that Anne alluded to. So we were able to conclude that it looks like at present universities across New Zealand and Australia lack coordinated financial support strategies, and it looks like more targeted approaches are required, but more importantly, to make accessibility open to students, or easier for students to access. Next slide, please, Jo. So the outcomes of the scoping review led us to adopt a salutogenic framework for the remainder of our project. And many of you will have heard of the salutogenic model, which is often used in health promotion. This model comes from a strengths-based approach. So it's understanding how, in our case, students could effectively swim upstream against financial adversities and reinforce their sense of coherence. So in order to be able to have resilience, financial resilience. I think this is important in terms of not providing just crisis relief, but giving financial resilience. So helping students really navigate through the river of university life. That's the analogy that we're hoping to apply to all of our findings. And I would like to quote the late Archbishop Desmond Tutu from South Africa, a very close friend of Nelson Mandela. He very wisely said, there comes a point where we need to stop just pulling people out of the river. We need to go upstream and find out why they're falling in. So I'll now hand over to our next speaker, Jo. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karen. Sorry, I was just trying to turn my camera on. I'm going to briefly discuss the findings from our desktop audit. The aim of this desktop audit was to understand the visibility and accessibility to financial aid supports on 41 Australian university websites. So the data were collected systematically by current students who completed an 18-item survey examining the presence of financial aid web pages and the ease of using these web pages. Gaps in the information and best practices were identified by categorizing the data And the findings are described on the next slide. So there were two key findings: limited awareness and challenge in access, which ultimately lead us to say that there is a need for policy reform. Significantly, only 38% of university websites had a clearly visible financial inclusion strategy, in spite of the majority of universities having financial support web pages themselves. Nearly half of the students collecting the data had difficulty in navigating to these web pages around financial support, and this hindered their access to applying for any financial aid support or seeing what was available. So this leads us to the need for policy reform. This demonstrates a need for accessible financial aid policies across all universities, as well as clearer communications of the financial aid services from these universities to the students. And just coupling in with that, we also determined that simplifying application processes for financial aid was also a requirement. So now I'm going to hand over to Dr. Katherine Kent, who's going to talk about the empirical evidence.
Thank you, Jo. As suggested by Anne earlier, while we as academics would like to think of university as a time for learning and growth, we found in our scoping review and desktop audits that for many students, financial insecurity is a daily struggle. So we wanted to dig deeper and understand this with some more up-to-date data from student and staff perspectives. Next slide, please, Jo. We wanted to understand how bad is financial insecurity and who is struggling the most, and how is this affecting academic success? And what support is available, if any? So to answer these questions, we ran two separate surveys in late 2024. A student survey with 907 students from across Australian universities and some from New Zealand shared their experiences with financial insecurity, the challenges they face and how it impacts their studies. Slide, Jo. A staff survey of 77 university staff, including lecturers and student support officers and program directors, told us what they're seeing in their roles and how students are coping or not, and what services are available at their university and what they think the gaps are. And what we found is a very serious problem that we think that universities can't afford to ignore. Next slide. First, let's talk about who we surveyed. The students came from all walks of life. Just over half were female, and the average age was around 26 years of age. 6% identified as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander, and about 15% were living with a disability. 1 in 3 students who responded to our survey were international students. Students were studying across a range of disciplines, and the largest group were from health, society and culture, engineering and business. And most were full-time students. So these financial pressures were affecting students who were really fully immersed in university life. Slide. Now onto the staff. Most of our respondents here were female, and over 60% had worked in education for more than 6 years. So these aren't people who are new to the sector. They've seen how student finances have changed over time. Most staff said that they worked with both domestic and international students. Nearly half worked in student support services. These are the people on the front lines directly helping students in financial distress, and the rest included lecturers, program directors, tutors and academic advisors. So we have a lot of unique perspectives here on student struggles. Slide. So what did the students tell us? 32%, that's nearly 1 in 3, said that they were financially insecure. What this meant was that they had said that they were struggling or severely struggling with their current financial status. And for many, this wasn't just cutting back on extras. This was choosing between rent and food and tuition. Some students were at much higher risk than others. For example, international students were significantly more likely to experience financial insecurity. Indigenous students had over 2 times higher odds of inadequate financial security. Students with disability and those students who were also living alone were at significantly higher risk. For these groups, the financial stress wasn't just an inconvenience, it appears to be a major ongoing barrier to education. Slide. When we asked the staff what they saw happening on campus, they confirmed it. Most staff, 84%, said they regularly see students who are struggling financially. More than half of staff said that students were struggling or severely struggling, and only 5% said that they were thinking that students were financially comfortable. And what's making things worse? Well, inflation and COVID's lasting impact. Most staff said that the financial stress that they're seeing has increased substantially over the past few years. Slide. Staff had said, very similar to the student survey who we identified at being at higher risk, were students who were living away from home and international students. But staff were also seeing students from lower income areas, or those who are living with a mental health disability, and students who are parents or carers as being the highest at risk of financial insecurity. Slide. When we asked our students what were their biggest challenges, it was these four things that kept coming up over and over again. Students said that rent was some of their biggest financial pressures, and a lot of students said that they struggled to afford to eat. Other students, around half of students, said that their tuition costs and transports were major stresses. Slide. Mandatory placements was often brought up as something that was causing further financial strain. It came up again and again. One student said unpaid placements, which are full-time and prevent students from working in paid jobs, was what was exacerbating their financial strain. Slide. And staff completely agreed. When we asked staff what the biggest financial challenges were, they came up with the same top four. Most said housing and food were the major barriers. Many had said that they have seen students skipping meals or delaying rent payments just to afford their tuition and their placement, and that transport was a big problem, in particular for students who are international students. So what we can see is that these financial pressures are really apparent to staff. These aren't just numbers. We can see that this is really affecting students' daily lives. When we asked staff about the types of things that they were dealing with when they were supporting students with key financial challenges, this word cloud really brings those main words out. They are dealing with things like work, family, placement, not being able to afford all of their expenses, and struggling with travel as well. Slide. So how is this financial insecurity actually impacting on students? Well, 1 in 2 of the students who responded to our survey said that their financial struggles was negatively impacting their studies. And not only that, those students who we classified as facing financial hardship were actually 5 times more likely to report struggling academically. And not only that, they were 11 times more likely to experience food insecurity. Students reported juggling multiple jobs, and that meant that they had much less time for their coursework, they felt they had fewer opportunities to engage, and they were at risk of increased burnout. Slide. Importantly, when we are looking at how students are coping, we can see that they're employing a range of different coping strategies. We have the data presented here by those students by inadequate financial status in the red and adequate financial status in the blue. What we can see is that students are using a lot of different coping strategies, regardless of whether we've classified them as inadequate or adequate financial status. But importantly, we can see that many students who are of inadequate financial status are taking out loans. They also seem to be more likely to reducing their study load, and they're also much more likely to delay their graduation, probably because they're struggling to make ends meet. Slide, Jo. What I feel that this data highlights, and I really want to drive home as it relates back to this salogenic model introduced earlier, is that students are actually already doing everything they can to manage their financial security. And this appears to be coming at a cost. Slide. Staff confirmed what we are seeing in the student data. Most staff said that they're seeing students working multiple jobs while they're studying, and over half of staff are seeing that students are reducing their course loads or dropping subjects due to financial stress, And over half of staff also said that they're seeing students taking leave of absences because of financial issues. This concept of the impact of financial insecurity is really impacting students in completing their degrees. Slide. So when we asked students about what they're doing to get support from their university, very concerningly, most students, 76%, said that they actually didn't know about what financial services were available at the university. Slide. And students with inadequate finances were at significantly higher odds of not knowing about the available support. The barriers to accessing support included very complex applications, fear of stigma, and restrictive eligibility. So when we looked at the students who were accessing support, we can see that those with adequate financial status are much more likely to report accessing scholarships, grants, going to budgeting workshops, and getting student welfare services. And those with inadequate financial status are much more likely to be asking for emergency funds and coping in other ways. Very concerningly, students who are having inadequate financial status are about 2 times more likely to say that they're dissatisfied with the uni support services. So not only are they less likely to know about the services available, but when they're using them, it's not helping them. Joe, next slide, thanks. Staff also identified this massive concern in that 40% of the staff who responded to our survey said that they didn't really actually know how to support students in financial distress. They said their universities most commonly gave food pantries, scholarships, and other financial support, and they also recognised the stigma and barriers that prevent students from accessing these services. Slide. Very concerningly, 1 in 2 of the staff who responded to our survey said that their university lacks a formal financial inclusion strategy. And if we have a look at this graph here, where the green bars represent excellent and good, and the amber and red bars represent poor and very poor responses, we can see that university staff report that most staff are broadly aware of how to support students facing financial distress, but that they perceive that there's very poor action from university executive at the Vice Chancellor and Deputy and the Associate Dean level. And with that, I am finished up, and I think, Joe, we can just whiz through those because they're a bit extra and I've run out of time. Thanks.
So thanks very much, Katherine. So we also conducted in-depth interviews with those participants from the survey who were interested to give their more lived experience of these circumstances. And it is quite a lot of work, but I will just briefly touch on that right now. Thanks. So in terms of the process, we followed thematic analysis, and we used Braun and Clark approach to go into depth and do iterative thinking around the interviews that were conducted over 34 in the October to December timeframe. What was clear out of the final analysis is that financial buoyancy is fundamental to students maintaining their overall student well-being. And that financial buoyancy is really moderated by both buffering agents and aggravating agents. And certainly we'll look in the slide in a minute, but basically what that means is that those factors also interact with each other. And certainly there are some of the levers that we can look at to pull to change that financial buoyancy, supporting overall well-being, which really not just mental and physical health, also talks about academic success, because that's why they're there in the first place, but also social engagement. A lot of these students are becoming further and further socially isolated, which adds to that weight of mental and physical health problems and actually stops them from succeeding in terms of their tertiary success. Next slide, please. So quickly on this slide, you can see the buffering agents on the left-hand side are really more life requirements. So accessing enough food or even the food preferences, particularly problematic for some of our international students with their cultural preferences and being able to afford those. Housing security, as we've already mentioned, having those coping mechanisms and have the resilience to actually continue to cope. And of course, on the right-hand side, we have aggravating agents, which we would call often in health, some of those are non-modifiable. You can't change where you come from, and also the burden that that might create in terms of the issues that you've come in with, limited social or financial support, particularly if you're moving to universities that are far away from all your usual social support systems. But it's better that I let the students speak about this, and I'd like the next slide, please, Joan. We'll listen to them.
I almost quit because I didn't know how to pay for placement.
I wasn't aware of available services until much later. I
felt emotionally broken with no peers around me.
Every day I think about money. I
had to choose between buying a textbook or food.
There are times when you have to skip lectures because you have to work.
So what's really compelling about all those interviews is the true lived experience, the real mental anguish, and the real desire, and to employ all those coping mechanisms that we've seen in the student survey, to do their very best to empower themselves as much as possible. But they are often being overwhelmed by those aggravating factors. And there's some of the things we could really pay attention to, as well as the basics about housing security and food access, to ensure that those students actually do get their financial buoyancy and succeed and have better overall well-being. I mean, it's been 26 years, and I have always said to my students, I want you to succeed, but I want you to do it and enjoy your studies. I'm not seeing much of that now. This is also was reflected in the staff interview key findings, where we really recognised that the living expenses and the basic costs were really impacting students, and particularly at-risk students. That was affecting their overall well-being. And again, consistent with all our studies, we're seeing that there are support systems at universities, but they could be a lot better. They could reduce some of the barriers, and there was genuine input from staff about how we could do that. Now, all this ladders up into our opportunities in terms of our evidence-based guidelines and recommendations, and I'll hand over to Kylie now to do that.
Hi, everyone. So one of the really key components of this project was actually translating the research into practice. Next slide, Jo. So as we think about what actually we can do as a sector to address this underlying issue to improve the financial well-being of students, one of the really important approaches is a holistic, joined-up approach. So from the research, we've seen universities, particularly at a grassroots level, doing a lot of good work to support things like food security. We are seeing action being taken by the government in terms of things like the introduction of placement grants, reducing HECS help. But what we're, I guess, proposing as a result of this project is that we need a coordinated, joined-up approach at all levels of the sector to ensure that the university experience that our students are experiencing is a financially inclusive one. So using the cellogenic model that was referenced earlier in the research, we have a range of practice-based recommendations that aim to address and support students really at the top of the river before, to help them to address these issues before they hit those downstream impacts. And we need that to be done at a government, community and organisational level. But in addition to that, there are a whole range of professional, interpersonal and personal supports that can be undertaken to support students every day in their experiences of university as well. Next slide, Jo. So I think, first of all, we're going to have a look at what can be done at a government level and what we're proposing as a result of this research. I've seen a lot of questions in the chat that talk to this, but you know, currently, like we said, we've got government-funded payment schemes such as Youth Allowance, AusStudy, AbStudy. We've got government schemes that are reducing the HECS help debt, and the introduction of things like placement grants for students as well. However, there is more that we believe that can be done at a government level to address the systemic barriers that students are having in terms of their financial wellbeing, including the need to increase the government-funded payment schemes, as well as expanding the placement payments to be more inclusive of students in a wider range of disciplines, and ensure there are also a range of students that you know, who are not eligible for means-tested Centrelink, and they're often there's a group of students that often miss out on that type of financial support. And so we need to look at not what we're doing for students who are already receiving government support, but students who potentially just a near miss or just fall out of those buckets as well. The other things that we're proposing as well at a government level is looking at things like public transport support. So, for example, international students do not get the same access to concessions for public transport as domestic students do in universities in some states. As well as, and this was mentioned in the QA as well, working very closely with professional accrediting bodies on the basic skills and knowledge that graduates need from an accreditation perspective, and also then subsequently exploring alternative experiential learning to demonstrate the skills. And so basically with the fundamental result to revisit placement requirements in partnership with professional bodies as well. At a university strategic level, we heard earlier around the absence of leadership in some spaces around the financial wellbeing of students across universities. And so we identified, you know, what did good look like for some universities that were really strategically leading the financial inclusion of university students. And those universities had things like university-wide financial inclusion plans. They had an executive champion. They had a financial inclusion senior executive task force. They had established institution-wide student success funds, and they had evaluation and program logics in place to support impact. In addition to this, we saw other universities changing their entire teaching and learning model to be able to support students, to be able to balance caring and work commitments along with their studies. And also, research-informed practice was a really important part of this. Jo, next slide as well. In addition to this, there were a whole range of practical activities that some universities were undertaking to support students to succeed with their financial wellbeing. And a lot of universities also talked about the benefit of that investment into their students, had a retention benefit and a return on investment benefit back to the university. So a lot of universities talked about the benefit not only to the student, but to the university themselves, which I think is really critically important given the financial constraints that are experienced by universities across Australia at the moment as well. But universities provided a whole range of ideas and activities that they were doing to support students with their financial wellbeing. Everything from the provision of free learning resources and study spaces and technology loans through to increasing and enhancing their centralised web presence for financial support and normal communication campaigns that normalised help-seeking behaviour. And finally, there were a whole range of other supports that were identified as well, such as proactive grants, emergency financial supports, interest-free loans, on-campus employment opportunities that were identified being delivered by student support teams, as well as administration teams that were looking at embedding low-cost nutritious meals into their lease agreements of food outlets, simplifying processes to apply for equity scholarships, and training and upskilling staff to identify and triage students who need support. Another huge focus of some universities have been to address the accommodation and housing crisis amongst students as well, and putting in strategic plans and dedicated housing support for students. So I guess what we have described here are a range of a holistic approach to how we might, as a university sector, address the concerns that we have around financial well-being of university students in a way that identifies on the ground, tangible things that we can be doing right now to support our students, right up to systemic changes that we can make at the top of the river to stop those downstream impacts. Thanks.
Okay, so back to me to complete this plethora of studies that you've seen today. I'm hoping that you see that there's continuity and congruence in all our studies and in terms of the factors that are really affecting our students right across the board. We definitely favour the salutogenic model because it is strength-based, but it also gives us real opportunity to see the levers at the various levels that could create a different experience for all our students. Like I said, we want them not just to succeed, we want them to enjoy their studies. That is actually fundamentally critical for the brains trust for the future of Australia, as well as the diversity of all our professions, both within health and within teaching and all the other professional spaces. And in terms of this final spot, it's just to remind ourselves of the salutogenic model. So when we're talking about the various layers, we're talking about the upstream. So that's where we're really talking about the reform around helps and help, thinking particularly around probably cohorts you may not even consider as being really challenged. So our medical doctors and our clinical psychologists have very onerous placement requirements and are very reluctant to speak about the financial challenges they face. They are very stigmatized or feel they're stigmatized to even mention it. So opening up different ways to access funds is what some of the things they've already suggested. So they are already recognizing how they could address this into their future. But certainly at the midstream level, there's really opportunities for more clearer opportunities around the workplace, around universities, working with community, identifying those that might also lead to skill development. And we certainly hear that from international students. Their ability to access employment opportunity is really limited. They come with maybe employment background from international experiences, but they don't have current references locally, and it's fine. They find it very difficult to go through that barrier to get jobs and access jobs. And certainly sort of within that space, we're also really interested in working with accreditation bodies around the requirements they're placing on students in terms of placements and really revisiting that. We have a lot of new technology and approaches that we could look at placements and looking at ways to make sure students meet the accreditation requirements, but without potentially the onerous extra hours and days that they're spending on placements to demonstrate that. And finally, in terms of at the interface of the university, there is definitely many academics and professional staff that are not just doing the work, they're personally putting in. I have staff members at the University of Wollongong that, for instance, buy the uniforms that students need on placement back from other students and then send that on to the new students because they know people can't afford them. So people at the university space are trying to address it and doing so because they actually really care about the progress of the student. I think everybody does, and probably everybody does in this webinar, and I can see that from the chat. But what we're doing here is providing current evidence and allowing us to do something in each space to make a difference to that development of brains trust into the future. Next slide, please, Joe. So really, we've got the report, it will be coming out. We've got our recommendation and guidelines, they will be coming out. But what we want to see is this fairer, more inclusive higher education, acknowledging these increasing aggravating factors that are impacting. And then I'll be able to address some of these questions in depth with my team in the final question time. Thanks, Ian. Next slide, Joe, please. Question time.
Thank you very much, Anne and team, and you've got perfect timing as well. We'll now move to Q&A, but before we do that, just a reminder to the audience that if you have any questions, please do use the Q&A button and the Q&A function to input your questions. We've got a lot of questions that came in throughout the presentation, so I'm going to move straight to those. And for the audience, if you would really like to know the answer to any question, please do use the upvote function so that they get prioritized on my screen. The first question for Anne and team: is there any appetite or calls for a review into the need for placements or reduction in the hours required for them? A reduction in placement hours would seem to be an easy way to reduce the financial impact.
I think that certainly from my last comment, you probably caught that as well. I think we're all in total agreement, and certainly, I mean, it is quite challenging because for every professional space with the growth of knowledge, then we want our students to be on the forefront, which means we are requiring them to do more and more to be efficient and appropriate in their accreditation space. But I think we need to revisit that and across the board potentially really consider what is the basic need and what are the things that people can do in their specialization space afterwards to really reduce that number of hours that they have to be on placement without support. And it's a really critical discussion. And I know lots of accrediting bodies are really looking at that, but it's something we should address.
Thank you very much, Anne. The next question, it seems that universities are all about the student experience and improving that for students, and yet we see systemic issues that impact students and their experience, particularly women. How can we facilitate access to supports, particularly for women?
Oh, look, that's a big question. I don't think that you'll find any argument from the team of researchers here that will not disagree with that. I think what our research has shown is that there are really clear vulnerable groups that are coming in that really need to be paid attention to. I know from my experience as a head of students that one of the challenges we have for women particularly is getting them what we call a access plan because they've got carers responsibilities and it's currently not in the normal space for access and inclusion, and it needs to be. And, you know, I think one of our, I don't know whether Kelly wants to say, but we know we've got a current student who's trying to breastfeed a baby, go through her final year and get placement. This is real life problems and we need to do it differently. Does anyone else want to respond? No?
We might move on to the next question then, but I would probably add before we move on that a lot of the issues that you've identified are actually issues that cut across different sectors. You know, probably would involve governmental action, and there needs to be a lot of advocacy, a lot of, I think, cooperation to ensure that we have a multifaceted approach to solving these issues. Was there any exploration into student-led organizations, associations, and unions who are often at the forefront in supporting and advocating for students?
Well, certainly we approach those particularly to distribute our surveys and invite them to participate. So they were included in that initial recruitment phase of our studies, and we tried to get that as much as possible. We didn't directly target them, but we certainly targeted them to distribute the survey data.
Could I just add to that, Anne? I think the question is more about our student support services, like our Pulse, I guess, that students pay their SAF funds to. Were they looked at in the desktop review? I think that's the question. So maybe Joe or Kylie want to respond to that?
Kylie there?
Yep. Sorry. It's just taking a minute to turn on. Yes. Yeah. So, Joe, my understanding from the desktop review is that included student associations. It was holistically looking at a university and all of the different financial support. So whether we didn't distinguish necessarily whether it was a university or a students association that was delivering, for example, a food pantry. So yes, my understanding, Joe, is that it did include both of those things.
I understand it. I mean, yes, it did. We didn't distinguish between the two. We just asked the students collecting the data through that survey to really see whether they could find any information and how easy it was, and not necessarily where exactly that information was located.
Thank you. Our next question is on placement, and we did have quite a few questions on placements coming through in the Q&A. This particular question says that nursing students historically were paid for their placements to recognize the value of the labor they provided in the hospital system. And it is now the experience of many students, nursing students on placement, that their labour is essential to provide or maintain a minimum level of patient care. It takes a long time, 26 weeks or 6 months of unpaid hospital labour under the current training system. Is it time to reconsider the value of this labour and pay students fairly? And someone else has chimed in and said, should we just ban unpaid placements outright?
Oh, there's nothing like a political question. Look, I think there's no doubt that we have to revisit this. Like, it's impossible. Like, I speak to our discipline spaces as well, of course, and I say to them, you know, students are doing it tough on placement, and they go, I did it tough on placement. I went, not the same. Can you work for 100 days without pay? Seriously, now in this climate? I don't think it's possible. I think there's a real opportunity to revisit this. I think Kelly might want to also add to this as well. Did you want to say something, Kelly?
Yeah, for me, it's a bit like a death by 1,000 cuts for some groups of our students, because they can't access prac payments, they can't access, you know, travel support, they can't access accommodation, they can't access, you know, supports to help them with uniforms. So in the end, I think they just give up, and that's why the solutions have to be multifaceted at very, you know, numerous different levels. So for me, just, you know, one of those solutions is not enough. We have to look at every single level. Yes, we look at the number of hours. Yes, we have to look at their inherent requirements. Yes, we have to work with accrediting bodies, but let's go back down to the other level, which is let's look at transports, subsidies, food, and so on. So it's a really complex question. I don't know if I answered it, but that's my piece. Yeah.
Yeah, and I just like reinforce like that student that I mentioned who's on her final 6-week placement in nursing, paying over $3,000 to work for free to meet her accreditation requirements. That's not okay. So yes, I do think we need to look at that. And it's really causing significant burnout. Our social workers are also doing 1,000 hours. Our clinical psychologists, we barely get to see any of those because the second year is almost fully placement orientated, unpaid. Yep, we have to look at this. Totally agree.
Yeah, so I think there is some, there has been some steps forward. I think it was late last year, some government subsidies, $319 a week, but only for certain disciplines, including education, I believe. So there are still many, many disciplines that are not covered in that government subsidy. And the question is why, and I don't know what the underlying reasons are for why certain sectors were covered and others were not. So we still have some more advocacy to go, I think.
Yeah, and problematic, as I think I've mentioned earlier, is that you have to be eligible for that. So you already have to be on a certain level of finance, which is totally appropriate, except many of our students, like I said, are self-funded and they are coming under their parental income, which is actually disingenuous for many students. They're not able to get supported by their parents, but they're still not able to get funds because of that, which also means they're not eligible for the placement payments. Very concerning for me.
Thank you. And I understand through the chat that my audio is now coming through very echoey. I hope I've resolved it. Next question from Tom Worthington. I'm on the Australian Computer Society board, which sets accreditation requirements for computing degrees. The students can do project work as an alternative to placement, and that helps with international students in Canberra who have difficulty getting a placement, paid or unpaid, due to security constraints. Should other professions be doing this?
I'm not entirely clear about that particular discipline space, but I think there's a genuine issue with international students that I think has flavoured through all our studies in terms of their ability to access employment. And certainly some of the interviews that I had with international students reflected that position, that their experience from other countries was not recognised here, which meant they weren't eligible to get into certain internships and other placement sites. And there may be other things, like you said, that prevent them from doing that. So I do think a different process and a more open process about how all students can access these employment and internship opportunities does need to be thought through. Like, against that multi-layer approach, we need to think about it at all levels, and particularly the ones we've already identified, which we're all aware of, that are most at risk of vulnerability.
Thank you, Anne.
Can I,
Would
Ian,
online, yeah.
share an example? Sorry. As a result of this work, there's been some contact with our team from organisations such as Rotary, who wish to offer supported accommodation for students doing placement in rural areas. But I think that's a really innovative model of thinking outside the box, where organisations like that could help alleviate some of the immediate stress for students. But I think we need to probably also think more broadly about subsidies and payments as well. But I thought that was a really neat idea that's come from people actually living in the country wanting to encourage people to move there after they've done some placements. So it's a win-win in some ways. Thanks.
Yeah, and finally on that point, just to remind people that what we also heard in the research is that people are choosing placements because of their financial capacity, not because of their genuine interest or desire to get capability and experience in certain spaces. They just can't afford to go to some places, so they restrict their experience because of that. And universities are trying to help them to do that, but that means they're not getting what we want them to do, their full experience and exposure.
Thank you. Next question, would online part-time study help or hinder? That's a tricky one.
Look, I think there's been a mixture of that already through COVID. Us academics who've lived through that process nearly died in the first 3 weeks, but we got through it. I think there is a genuine interest for that for some cohorts of students. I think a mixed bag is what I'm talking about here. Students still love that face-to-face experience, that interaction, that networking, that straight in front of the academic and asking the questions and pulling apart those information. So a mixture is still what we need. But to enable that mixture, we need to put that other stuff in place. They need to be able to eat. They need to be able to have some job that allows them to do that. And they need a house that's nearby. And they certainly need accommodation transport. Like some of our international students in different states do not qualify for student travel, which to me is bizarre. So they're paying double the other students to get to certain places to meet the requirements of their study. That's not okay. Oh, Ian, you're on mute, just so you know, sorry.
Sorry about that. Any strategies or reforms to be done for compensating the done damage to students who may have failed a lot of units due to the struggle with finance, hunger, mental health issues, or disabilities? What to do when damage is done, and how can we help those students?
Does
I might take that one, Anne.
Yeah,
yeah, I might take that one.
Yeah.
Look, I think I think I'm drawing on colleagues' practice from across the sector, because I think there's some really fantastic work that's being done by some universities in addressing these most vulnerable cohorts of students. So I have seen some really good practice where universities are proactively outreaching to those students, putting in place a student success plan. Part of that may include a student receiving a scholarship to help support, or a grant to help support them return to study for the following year, and potentially receiving like a peer type coach as well. So there are some really good different examples happening across the sector, but I agree that when you look at the likelihood of students who've failed a subject, who failed subjects, and their likelihood to persist with their higher education study, they are the most vulnerable cohorts. They are the least likely to succeed, and there is national and university level data that helps support that. So in understanding why the student is failing, and putting in place whether it is academic or wellbeing or financial supports to support that student, there is some good practice examples across the sector where universities are doing that.
And I think drawing on that, drawing on that is really important. They're to get those best practice evidence-based approaches that work really well. Because we, in academic land, professional land at the university space, know how crushing that is when a student doesn't succeed. It's not just for the moment at their university life, it follows them throughout their life that they were a failure, and it's not what we want for our student cohort moving forward.
Thank you, Anne and Kylie. We have time for one last question, and apologies to those others who've asked questions, but we didn't have time to get through today. But in the interest of time, we'll move to the last question. Do the speakers have any thoughts and reflections on how universities can transform their decision-making processes to ensure that students are not just consulted, but actually have equal power in shaping the financial support systems and policies that directly affect their lives.
I'm sure I can throw to everybody on that, but like one of the first approaches that we use actually within research is called co-design. And co-design as a methodology is that you work together to understand the problem and to move forward. And I think many universities are actually bringing in students as part of their advocacy and communications and also providing input into the various strategies. I think that's fundamental and totally agree. It's not being done to, it's being done with. And I think that's fundamentally important if we're moving forward. I don't know if anyone else wants to say something.
Well said, Anne. I agree. Plus also support from the top has to come from the top. There's no real change otherwise. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think just on that point, that's a really good one. I mean, if we really want universities to succeed in this space, they really have to have secure funding that doesn't move with the times around budgeting. They really need to have fundamental funds that are in reservoir to enable us to address that. And I saw someone make a comment about, is there opportunity in terms of private funding or other bursaries or other kind of modelling? I think that's incredibly important to success of business organisations across Australia. They need to have great students coming through. And I'm sure people would welcome the opportunity to see that funding being transformed into that support services. So definitely an opportunity.
Thank you very much, Anne and everyone. And we are 1 minute over time, but that tells us about the great interest that everyone has in your study. I would like to thank everyone for your participation, and thank you again to the study team for this really important study and for your time today in sharing your results. The recording of the presentation will be available after today, and the final report that the study team has produced will be published on the ACSES website in a couple of months. Have a good day, everyone, and see you all at the next ACSES event. And please do subscribe to ACSES for notifications on upcoming events and publications. Thank you.
And thank you to all the staff and students who support us, and the amazing Edzene who helped us get this work done. Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.